As a speech, man.
It's a speech. It's a speech.
Vote for Shanice.
Hopefully one day.
What party are you running for?
Yeah, hopefully one day.
The Yes We Can party.
Yes, we can. Oh,
Yes,
God.
we can.
What's going on, people? Hello and welcome to this week's Life of the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with left-wing political organising in Britain. I'm your host, Jonas Marvin, and I'm here with my friends and comrades, Shanice McBean.
Hello.
And Joe Todd.
Hello.
This week, Joe is going to kick off the episode with some news on Zach Polanski's Greens.
Yeah, so we got a bit of composite news on the Greens this week because we are not going to talk about Andy Burnham for every episode of this podcast for the rest of the time. We're not going to do that. We're going to talk about the Green Party.
That's a lie.
We're going to talk about the Green Party. We're going to talk about the Green Party. So there's two bits of Green Party news that I kind of wanted to highlight. Number one, last week there was this story briefed by somebody in the Green Party, I assume the leadership, saying that they're going to look at how the party rules work and specifically around policy as the membership's gotten a lot bigger. This is, I think, in response to a frustration that's coming from the leadership that, frankly, I am quite sympathetic with, which is that because the Green Party is so hyper-democratic in quite a formal way, it means that the leadership can't say anything that isn't formally written down in policy that's been passed by a conference at some point. So, for instance, during the Iran war crisis, when oil companies were making massive profits off the war, he couldn't go out and say, we should, levy their profits or put 100% tax on them, because conference had never passed that, even though I'm sure Green Party members would be completely in favour of something like that because it's within the spirit of the direction of the party at the moment. So they're talking about that, and they're also talking about changing conference, either so more people can attend or more people can vote through having online voting or something like that. Nice little tidbit. One person has organised Green Party conference for the last 20 years.
Oh, I saw that. That's
the
mad.
same guy,
wow.
or woman, sorry, the same person. The same person has done this for the last 20 years. What a hero. And then the next bit of news I wanted to highlight is that the Greens have selected their Manchester mayoral candidate. Yeah. So, Burnham stepped down. He's an MP now. He's going to become leader. We'll probably talk about him at some point in the future and in the past. And there's a Manchester mayoral race. The Greens have selected somebody called Geraldine Coggins, who's going to be running against Bev Craig, who's the Labour council leader at the moment. Reform have picked Sian Astley, who is their lead councillor of their group in Manchester, but was also on BBC One's DIY SOS and BBC Two's Your Home Made Perfect series before going into politics.
Oh, wow.
We can do a bit of sociological analysis of that and how she ended up in Reform. I think the reason I want to highlight it is because, look, I don't know Geraldine Coggins. I've never met her. I've just watched the videos of her on the internet. She's a lecturer at the local uni. She's kind of like a deep green. She's been in the party for a long time. And the communications that they put out so far, I would just describe them as kind of like anti-Zach. And not anti-Zach as in attacking Zach, but anti-Zach as in kind of the opposite of Zach Polanski, in that she's not leading on vision. She's not leading, using her charisma to outline this broad kind of political horizon that we could go for. The start was just, frankly, a scare message about how, it's Greens versus Reform in Manchester and all of these really dodgy bar charts. When it's not Greens versus Reform, all the polls suggest it's actually Labour versus Reform. So you're opening with something that's non-political, but also number two, going down this route of basically lying to people who are watching this video. And then the whole thing's shot in a field when she's running. She's running to be the mayor of a city. And I'm not saying there aren't fields within Greater Manchester. I don't want to listen to
lots.
Yeah, I'm sure there are lots. But most people would expect somebody that's running to be the mayor of a city to be walking the streets of the city. Maybe I'm being conventional here. Maybe actually like standing in the field is really smart and actually that speaks to people in Greater Manchester. But I just saw that and I'm like, oh my God. So anyway, those are the two things I want to highlight. I think that, there's some interesting rule changes on the horizon, very important for Green members and socialists within the party. And I frankly think we have a continuing leadership crisis across the left, which is now manifesting itself in the Green Party by the Greens not selecting a candidate for a massive mayoralty that's completely winnable. Completely winnable.
Yeah, I think the news about the Green Party thinking of shifting their kind of internal democracy is interesting. when I first read it, I immediately was struck by like the nightmare of your party and how your party's leadership attempted to gerrymander what happens at conference because they were uncomfortable with the kind of proposals that were coming from the membership. And I think you mentioned that the Green Party are being hamstrung by not being able to talk about what it wants. So specifically the leadership, not the Green Party in total, but the leadership being hamstrung by not being able to kind of lead almost, which is a fundamental problem. I think leaders should have autonomy to kind of set political direction, to be able to kind of intervene in narratives in somewhat of an independent way. You know, there's a certain element, I think, of trust that we put in our leaders to be able to pivot and to be able to shift and to be able to kind of switch things up as the moment demands. And I think that the inability to do that is real. At the same time, there's another way that they're being hamstrung, which I'm sure also sits equally uncomfortable for the Green Party leadership, which is that they are sometimes being pulled by motions that are coming from Green Party members to conference that they're probably uncomfortable with and would rather didn't happen, such as the Zionism is racism motion. And you could see when that was kind of being proposed at the various different Green Party conferences and then how that made it into the mainstream media, how uncomfortable Zach was with that motion and how he was trying to toe this kind of middle space between clearly being uncomfortable with the premise of the notion, but also not wanting to be seen to be a liberal Zionist in any way, but also not wanting to give in to narratives that the Green Party is anti-Semitic or that he's somehow disconnected from the Jewish community. And I suspect there's probably a motivation in this democratic review that is related to that discomfort and not just the fact that the leadership aren't able to do what leaders should do, which is intervene and lead. And that's why I kind of go back to that pang that I got from your party, because leaders often, when they are uncomfortable or when they are underconfident in their ability to sway membership, then lean on bureaucracy in order to sway power and sway influence in their direction. So, you know, I think a lot of Zach, so I hope that that's not what's going on. And I guess it remains to be seen.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of issues there in particular to that, right? I mean, I was reading the same briefing that you mentioned, Joe, and one of the things that was noticeable to your point, Shanice, is that the participation levels amongst the Green membership at the minute can be so distorted when it comes to conferences, right? Yeah. If you're and that's partly, which is a democratic problem, really. It's part of the thing that's trying to be addressed here, right? Is that, like, if you can easily get time off work, if you can easily get in your car and travel somewhere down for a conference, if you have a relative level of security and you're part of a kind of hyper-organized part of the party, which you'd expect goes to the left's favor, but clearly doesn't all the time, you're much more likely to be able to shape the political outcomes of the party. And then on the other side of that, there's just such little room for agility and agileness for Zach, right? Yeah. And that's kind of the worst of both worlds, really. And that's a big problem to address. Like, how do you get this party to involve as many people as possible in its democratic processes on the one hand, but then how do you also get it to be in a position where its leadership can lead politically and the stuff of running the party happens smoothly, right? In a moment where I think they're in a bit of trouble, the Greens, right? You could make the calculation that, the situation has changed over the last month qualitatively.
Why? Who changed it?
Well,
you say his name.
And so then you kind of recalibrate what the opportunities are over the next 3 to 5 years, right? That's a conversation that will take place in the Greens, for sure. Is the implication from that you kind of try to build your bases in some cities, in university towns, in some of the more affluent seaside places? What are the opportunities that exist in national elections rather than just municipal elections? So those sorts of questions, right? Because one of the things about Burnhamism, and I don't want to talk about Burnham, but you kind of just can't avoid it, really, is I think he is just playing a bit of a blinder, right? I think there's a lot of structural constraints on the amount of a blinder that he can play, and I think we will see that play out over the course of the next few years. But I don't know, My friend put it to me like it's almost like he's land grabbing some of the vibe and affect and even some of the policies of the Greens, or say council housing, for example, on a national scale. One thing I would say is that on the mayoral candidacy, I basically really agree. I think the idea that you could run a campaign on the basis of it being we are the people to defeat reform when you clearly aren't the people to defeat reform is a political disaster.
Yeah.
Like, it's one thing to kind of fall in line with all of the Progressive Alliance stuff we were kind of talking about last episode, and to that be the kind of anchor of your campaign. It's one thing to do that. It's another thing to do that when it's not true.
And just blatantly not true.
Just blatantly not true. So there was a video.
I just don't know who made that decision.
Yeah, no, it's crazy.
I just think it's an absurd strategic decision, whoever got to make that.
Yeah.
Just essentially lie in your launch campaign video. Yeah. And a lie that's just so easily refuted and just was easily refuted.
Yeah.
I just don't get it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was a video that came out today. I don't know if you saw it, with Zach and with Geraldine Coggins.
I haven't seen it.
Which was better.
Okay, fine.
So they were also in a field again this time, you know.
But why are they always in a field?
It was a park field rather than a field.
Okay, park's fine. Park's like the heart of a city. That's fine.
Big classic, very Manchester typical skyscrapers in the background, and it was all about housing.
Yeah.
It was still a bit of a lash up between like we're the people to stop reform, just like in Gorton and Denton, and like we have an agenda for housing and for a more positive and people-led regeneration of the city, rather than the kind of real estate-led regeneration of the city that we've seen with Burnhamism. But you know, it was a move in the better direction. But I think the problem here is Gramsci has this concept of passive revolution, right? Which is to say that there are moments when particular constellations of political forces, particular political individuals, are able to absorb some of the kind of dissident energies of the moment, right? The kind of dissident energies that saw 800,000 people sign up to your party, that saw the Greens quadruple their membership or whatever it was. And the worry is, I think, that Burnham is doing that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I look at that mayoral candidate video that you mentioned, Joe, and it gives Theresa May. Like, it's got that. I watched it and I was like, this is giving running through fields of wheat. And I don't just mean the aesthetics, even though, you know, there is that kind of like middle-aged white woman in a field vibe. But it was actually how detached it felt from the people that she was actually trying to speak to, which is the same thing that happened with the fields of wheat, right? She said it and it was like, no one has this experience. Like, it's completely detached from the people that you're trying to speak to. And I agree with you. It feels really antithetical to the direction that Zach Polanski's taken the Greens in, that kind of energy and that bombast and that, I don't know, it's that source that he's got, that he brought to the Greens. It just feels quite opposed to that. And I wonder if what we're witnessing is some elements of some kind of internal struggle playing out a little bit. Because, you know, I think Geraldine Coggins represents, if I'm not mistaken, the older, and I don't mean by age, I mean in terms of like the party infrastructure and the party establishment. She represents the older, possibly more skeptical layer of the party that is a little bit more distant to Zach Polanski's leadership and is a bit more distant to his kind of like fresher approach. And I wonder if there was some kind of low-level power struggle that's taken place that's kind of playing out in Manchester. Because if you look at Gorton and Denton, my understanding is Zach had quite a significant role to play in Hannah Spencer being selected as a candidate there, and his instincts were absolutely bang on. And Geraldine Coggins seems to be not quite the right candidate in some way. Can't exactly put my finger on it. And, you know, maybe this is me just going completely based off my own bias and stereotyped instincts, but it just doesn't, the vibe seems off. And you mentioned, Jonas, the kind of, both of you mentioned the kind of messaging around we're the guys to beat reform. If we haven't forgotten, Labour tried that in Gorton and Denton. It was an absolute flop. You know, no one was buying it on the ground, not just because it was factually untrue, but because it just didn't feel like it met the sentiment of the moment. And so, yeah, it's just really weird that they would go for that kind of messaging. I can understand going for, you know, we beat reform in Gorton and Denton, we can beat reform again. But trying to scare voters, I think the lesson of the political moment is you can't scare people into things anymore. People feel so disenchanted with the actual reality of the world. There's very little you can tell people to scare them even more about what the world could be like. Do you know what I mean? It's already so shit. So yeah, it's just something a bit off off going on.
The thing is that I do think it's fundamentally a failure of organising inside the party and a failure of socialists, including myself, because I'm a left-wing Green member, to properly organise in the party, because that was an open selection.
Yeah.
Anyone could run. The members in Manchester voted in the selection, and I watched the hustings, and no one was that good. It's not like there was a really like amazing left-wing candidate that was organised out. That wasn't the case. There just wasn't anyone that good. But we have a party of 210,000 people and loads more people outside of that party that the party would be fine for them to run as Green candidates. There are so many options for incredible candidates. They're just not making it to these hustings, and they're just not competing, and that's fundamentally an organising problem on our behalf.
I felt that was an issue in your party as well, because I know Jonas disagreed, but those early days of your party where we were really enthused and where there were options to put people forward for leadership, there's some incredible candidates, some incredible cadre in our movements, but they didn't put themselves forward, and I wonder what's going on there.
I think there's a meta problem, which is just the burden of leadership is really high.
Yeah.
It's just really hard to be a leader in the 21st century. You have to take so much shit. You're so visible, so much exposure. Your entire history is raked over.
Yeah.
It wasn't like that 20 years ago. I think that is just a massive thing.
The kind of organisational and strategic task of reproducing cadre as well, which is a key part of that process, right? Is also like it just requires having a political compass and an organisational set of facilities that are just a bit more developed than where the Greens are at right now.
Well, where a lot of the left is at.
The whole left, really.
Yeah.
It's not just the Greens' exclusive problem, for sure. One thing I was just going to say, kind of to this, tagging on what you said earlier, one of the problems for the Greens is that maybe Bev Craig, who will be the Labour's candidate for the Greater Manchester mayoralty, won't simply run a Progressive Alliance election, right? Maybe you get into a situation where there's a kind of retail bargaining war, right? Where Labour say, well, we're going to reduce bus fares and we're going to dish out all of these new renters' rights and all of this sort of stuff, right? Whilst kind of lauding the reputation that Burnham has. And that presents a big strategic problem if you're not able to break out of that Progressive Alliance language and think in terms of like, how can we fight to make people's lives better and have some real antagonisms with Labour over this? Because
100%.
there is a groundswell of feeling in Manchester that like, there's been all this growth in the city, but it's really only been in particular bits of the city rather than the Greater Manchester and District region. And it's often only benefited a particular group of people, or a small group of people, at the expense of private renters, council housing residents, low-paid workers. So there's opportunities there, but it's a difficult task ahead for the Greens.
And the thing is as well, look, there's a good argument that the Greens don't stand and never did stand much of a chance in this by-election, in this Manchester mayoral election, because the rising popularity of Andy Burnham, or Andy Burnham being at his kind of zenith, will see through whatever Labour candidate runs, to succeed him in Manchester. I think that's a fair argument. The problem is that the Green press team, after Makerfield, briefed that they'd been spending all of the time during Makerfield preparing for the Manchester mayoral as if this was their big shot. And look, I'm not necessarily blaming them, but I just think it speaks to a bit of an incoherent political strategy across the party. Maybe it's because the party just does have distributed centres of power. Press team can say one thing, and then local Manchester members select another person, and then I'm told the people that are in charge of the political strategy in the Manchester mayoral election are the field team. So, you know what I mean? Like, you have it distributed across different bits of the organisation. But I just think it makes us look a bit stupid to say that we've been preparing for this election for months, and then we do what we've done in the last couple of weeks.
All right. Well, there's about a month until we get the results of that election. So won't be the last time.
We know what the results are going to be, though.
It won't be the last time we cover it, I suspect.
I don't know.
I'd bet a load on Labour winning. I'd bet a lot.
There's a reform question here.
Yeah, there is. Massive one.
A supplementary vote, though. It's on supplementary votes. There's no vote split in.
That's true.
I'd be really surprised if Reform won it. Like, genuinely. I think Labour will win it.
Don't underestimate the Greater Manchester hinterlands, is all I would say.
Yeah, but Burnham just won in one of them.
For sure. But I don't know. I'm still a little bit reticent to call it a day on Reform.
Fine. There is a month.
All right. Thanks for that, lads. Next up, Shanice is bringing us one of the central questions of politics today. Go for it.
I am. It's on immigration. So we've been doing this podcast for nearly a year, and we've really barely touched on this topic.
It's hard.
It is a tricky one. But let's give it a crack. Initially preparing this, I thought, I'm not going to have much to say, but actually...
Imagine.
Come on, mate.
Preparing it, I've got a long list of notes here, so let's try and get through it. All right, so first of all, I think it is often assumed on the left that economism can stop the anti-migrant rightward drift, and that the question of immigration is more about living standards and kind of looking for someone to blame than it is ideology or values. That's, I think, quite a common assumption on the left. And I want to trouble this assumption a little bit. I think first thing, we all read some research a couple of weeks ago from the National Centre for Social Research, their report, Who Supports Reform? And I just want to read a quote from their conclusion because I think it's quite instructive. Quote, "Support for reform is not simply an expression of protest. Although those who back the party are more likely than voters in general to be struggling with the cost of living, to be concerned about the health service, and to be unhappy about how the country is being governed, they are distinguished above all by having a socially conservative outlook that is reflected in their attitudes towards immigration, equalities policies and welfare spending, and is underpinned by a demographic profile that is dominated by older voters and those who have not been to university." That suggests that, on their own, meeting successfully some of the policy challenges that currently face the government, such as reviving economic growth, increasing living standards, and improving the performance of the NHS, will not necessarily engender a significant reversal of the rise in support that has been enjoyed by reform since the 2024 election. And the research itself, so unquote, the research itself played with some of its statistics to figure out, are people who vote reform more likely to be disenchanted with the economic system? And they played with, are they therefore also more likely to have kind of right-wing views? And that's the conclusion that they came to. And I think this chimes with other things, right? So there was a poll that was done a year after Brexit, and it asked people about their living standards in relation to Brexit. And 61% of people said they were prepared to see significant damage to the economy in order to drive through Brexit. And that was a year after the vote. And even more startlingly, 39% of people surveyed a year after Brexit said they would be happy to see themselves or their family members lose their jobs in order to push through Brexit. So mad stats, right? Like mad stats. People were willing to lose their jobs to see the economy collapse in order to push through Brexit. I think there's something here going on that's much more than the economy. I watched the video from the Unite the Right march and people said they wanted more. There was one guy that I listened to and he was like, I knew Brexit, my life would be a little bit shit after it, but I just wanted my country back. I wanted control of our borders. W.E.B. Du Bois, his famous contention that there's more to the material experience of status in society than just money. He also argued that it's also psychological, that there's a psychological wage associated with power and hierarchy that pays just as well, sometimes more, than money. And Richard Seymour argues something quite similar in the tradition of W.E.B. Du Bois, although it is a different argument. But in Disaster Nationalism, he also argues that people are satisfied, almost, they are relaxed with the idea that the world is heading towards collapse. But as a result of that, there is a certain enjoyment that people get from violence, from wanton violence, from humiliating other people, from subordination of those that they resent, of those that are their kind of perceived enemies, of those that they consider weaker or less deserving. So for me, what all of these things together mean is that actually the question of anti-immigrant sentiment cannot just simply be reduced to economics. You can't just fix it by giving people, better access to the welfare state, better housing, better paid jobs, because there's something deeper here going on about our belief our very belief in whether the world can change or not, and the fact that people resign themselves to the fact that it can't. And so new desires are being unleashed, deep desires around kind of resentment and, you know, our feelings of resentment that run so deep that they end up being kind of exploded onto people who are viewed as weaker than or less than. And so, you know, I think the immigration question is as much about raw human emotion and psychology as it is about economics. But the left sometimes approach the immigration question from an economic standpoint, from a different perspective, which is not that you can just fix it by making the economy better, but actually it's that migrants make the economy better. And sometimes the left argue that we should actually feel favorably about immigration, and we should encourage people to feel favorably about immigration because migrants are a net benefit to the economy and they bring more in than they take out. So what should we make of this common argument? Well, first of all, I think the first point that I made suggests that this argument isn't going to really land with people who are ideologically opposed to immigration, because their primary concern isn't the economy. They'd actually be fine with seeing the economy tank if they get their country back, if they can control their borders. So that already makes this argument ineffective. But actually, I think from the perspective of the left, it's not a particularly helpful argument. So first of all, the fiscal impact of migration really varies depending on the route that a person takes into the country, depending on their personal characteristics, their age, their skills, their education, etc. And while on average, the fiscal impact of immigration does have a net positive to the economy, and essentially what that means is, you know, immigrants on average put more into the economy than they take out through benefits and healthcare, etc. That is true. And often migrants end up filling labour shortages and labour gaps that domestic workers are unable or unwilling to fill. That is true. But there are several problems with this line of argument. Number one, first of all, there's an inherent kind of liberal racism in the idea that migrants should just be here to do the shit jobs that domestic workers or white people don't want to do. I don't like that. This idea that, you know, there's a group of workers who can just be resigned to doing shit jobs. Yeah. That's an anti-class argument. That's an argument that gives consent to the notion that it's okay for the working class to be hierarchized, and that, you know, there are different strata of the working class and some have better working conditions than others. Inherently, I just don't like that. And number two, migrants are often super exploitable, right, due to their weaker rights and precarious status. And this argument that, you know, migrants are here to fill these shitty jobs often ends up consenting to the worst excesses of capitalist exploitation, where we're actually celebrating migrants for the shitty jobs that they do, which is the same as kind of just celebrating migrants for their economic position as hyper-exploitable workers. You know, we shouldn't be celebrating that. That's not a good thing. That there are people being made to do jobs that we don't want to do at really low wages. You know, that's not a thing to celebrate. That's a thing to fight against. But I think even more importantly is the argument that kind of migrants put more into the economy than they take out leaves untouched the fact that actually if we look at extraction of wealth and resources, it is the West that is extracting from the global South, not migrants coming from the global South extracting from Western countries. So, you know, even giving consent to that argument completely flips the actual global situation. You know, if we want to talk about who is taking from who, it's Britain and Germany and Italy and Europe and the US that is taken from the rest of the world. And we allow the conversation to fixate on whether migrants are extracting from us domestically, but we actually leave the international stage completely untheorized and completely unanalyzed. And you cannot have, I think, you know, a serious analysis of immigration without having that deep analysis of imperialism. So to give you just a snapshot of what I mean, it's estimated that between 1990 to 2015, i.e., you know, that's a real big chunk of the neoliberal era, the global North has appropriated £242 trillion in labour, raw materials and energy from the global south. And we're here having a conversation about whether migrants are a benefit to the economy or not. It's just completely backwards. Do you know what I mean? And that's the point. That's the argument that the left should be making. And it's craven that on top of the West being so extractive of the world and the voracious appetite that the West has, it's just morally wrong that people have the cheek to then turn around to migrants and be like, you're coming here taking our stuff. Well, good. Good, because the West is going over there and taking their stuff. And I think this is the kind of basic argument that we miss when we hyper focus on kind of what migrants are putting into the economy. And also, you know, again, it is a slight moralistic argument, but the idea that we should just reduce people to their economic value under capitalism is a very just capitalistic way of viewing human worth. And actually the right don't view their side in that way. You know, they create value through a political and moral lens, whether it's, you know, the ethnic nationalists who define value based on ethnicity, or define value based on nationalism, or define value based on kind of cultural conformity. The right are creating ideological frameworks through which they create citizenal value. And we are just defining people based on their economic worth, as opposed to putting forward a left-wing vision of what humanity and human value should look like. And I think this then leaves a situation where capitalists are able to have open borders, no problem. That's part of the status quo. But because we don't define our own values with regards to humanity and immigration, we're too fearful in the current context to even articulate human value beyond the kind of capitalist construction of economics, let alone going back to kind of, you know, old school variations of open borders arguments that are about centering kind of, you know, working class humanity. And I think the kind of the fifth problem with this economic argument is that oftentimes on the left, particularly in the trade union movement, there is this argument that immigration leads to falling wages domestically, and that's a reason to be against immigration or to have immigration controls. You know, this is a significant argument on the right of the trade union movement because it drives down wages. And, you know, the left historically, or not even historically in the current context, because historically that was a left-wing argument. But in the current context, I think the left really struggles to deal with this because actually, you know, the truth to that statement of whether migrants are driving down wages is uneven. Overall, there's a negligible impact to migration to wages overall. But if you look at specific sectors, there are some impacts, right? So, for example, if you look at migrants who come in who are highly skilled, highly educated, but also not able to get the top jobs, whether that's due to racism or due to other factors, and they end up filling jobs that are kind of lower than what they're educated for and swelling, you know, the workforce at lower levels, making jobs more inaccessible to other people as a result. That does happen. And at the kind of, I'm putting this in quotation marks because I don't believe in this term morally, but unskilled labour, there is some evidence to suggest at that level that there is a downwards pressure on wages. It's small, but that there is a downwards pressure on wages due to migration. But then if you look at it from a different perspective, migrants also consume. So they create jobs elsewhere. So actually it's quite uneven depending on how you look at this question. But if you're only judging the value of migration through economics, you don't really have an argument to counter, you know, what is quite a complex and uneven situation. And you end up giving consent to these backward arguments that the only reason that we should, you know, have people travel into this country is because it's economically good. You give consent to that argument if you don't have a vision of a global left-wing humanity. Again, the other issue with that argument is it just fails to recognize that regardless of whether we had migrants in this country or not, capitalism would always create a reserve army of labour to do the job of putting a downward pressure on wages. That is what capitalism does. A reserve army of labour creates a downward pressure on wages that is an inherent mechanism of capitalism, not an inherent mechanism of migration. And we need to be directing our ire towards capitalism as opposed to migrants. And, if it wasn't migrants that capitalism used as a reserve army of labour, it would be black people. And if it's not black people, it would be the urban poor. Capitalism will always create a reserve army of labour to drive wages down. That's what capitalism does. And so the issue shouldn't be migration or not. The issue should be, how do we create a socialist horizon? So the role of trade unions shouldn't be to legitimise those arguments. It should be to be a bulwark against them. But finally, I think the point that I want to make around migration is that the truth is our attempts to appeal to or relate to people who are ideologically opposed to immigration fails. And we see this time and time again. So look at the current government. Immigration has fallen over recent years, largely a continuation of Tory policy, but Labour has gone full-throated on it. They've proposed really quite cruel legislation, scrapping indefinite leave to remain, which is a reform policy, seizing assets from migrants. And this week, the Immigration and Asylum Bill of 2026 is kind of making its way through Parliament. Horrible, cruel things in this bill. It's going to be easier to deport people despite having family ties in Britain. It's going to be easier to deport people even when they've built a life here. It's going to be harder to appeal based on human rights. Asylum seekers, it's going to be harder to live here because they're going to have to pay back their asylum support once they get a job. So it's going to be even harder to build a life here. And believe it or not, a Labour government is making it even harder for victims of trafficking and modern slavery to make a case, because any delays or in reporting or any inconsistencies in someone's story or any omissions are going to be counted against them. And we know that trauma is fucked up, isn't it? We know that trauma creates delays in reporting, inconsistencies in your story, and omissions. That's what trauma does. And now, because you might be a traumatized migrant, it's going to be harder under a Labour government for your asylum claim to count, and it's going to count against your credibility. But despite all this horrific legislation, the Labour government is no more popular. In fact, it's less popular than it was when it first came in. And Labour is not and has never been able to be seen as the true inheritors of the kind of reform legacy that reform's building. And in fact, all they're doing is just laying the groundwork for reform to go harder if reform wins in 2029. And this is a typical trajectory for, liberal parties during periods of the rise of the far right and the rise of fascism. Liberals before Mussolini, who couldn't solve their economic crisis and couldn't solve the crisis of growing resentment, crushed striking workers. They gave a pass to street-based paramilitarism. And some liberals even aligned to Mussolini. And you look at Nazi Germany as well. German liberals before Nazism gave a free pass to Nazi agitation in the name of free speech, because they were united with the Nazis against communism, and they were allowed to propagandize completely unchallenged and uninhibited. And we're seeing some of the remnants. I don't think it's always helpful to hark back to 20th century fascism and be like, look, this is happening again. But we're seeing some of these remnants in Keir Starmer's ridiculous island of strangers nonsense. So tailgating the right doesn't work. So to sum up, it would be interesting to see what Andy Burnham does, because that immigration and asylum bill that I mentioned is unlikely to actually go through before the leadership race finishes. So it's going to be up to Andy Burnham to see what he does with that legislation. Will he continue to try to tailgate reform, or will he try to set forward a new path on immigration? But regardless of what Burnham does, on the left, we find ourselves constantly firefighting the worst elements of draconian racist immigration measures and an ever-shrinking set of rights. And I think instead what we need to do, instead of firefighting, is to put forward our own vision of what society should look like and what human relationships should look like across borders. That was a speech, man.
Speech. This is a speech.
Vote for Shanice.
Hopefully one day.
What party are you running for?
Hopefully one day.
The Yes We Can party.
Yes, we can. Oh,
yes,
God.
we can.
There's just so much there. I mean, one addendum I'd like to make is that, I don't think economics explains racism or anti-immigrant attitudes. I think you're totally right. And it's an enormous... I think you're totally right on this. There's an enormous amount of values-based racism that sometimes can be pretty unmoored from the economy, right? And I think we should kind of reckon with that. But I do think it's important that anti-immigrant racism thrives in those kind of zero-sum conditions, right? When the migrant or the asylum seeker, whether it's the hotel or the barbers, kind of stand in for decline. There's also that kind of materiality that you talk about within the labour market, right? So like even before Theresa May's hostile environment, you know, the Blairites had their own version of the hostile environment, right? That people kind of forget. The state embeds competitive logics into the labour market. So in the public sector, with public sector labour, you have essentially, not exclusively, but you have a lot of white workers who are essentially tasked with policing their migrant compadres within the workforce, which deepens hierarchies, right? In an already quite stratified labour market and undermines the potential for solidarity amongst workers. And I think part of the job of the left then is to identify, well, what are the organising possibilities that exist that push back against this in particular sectors? What kind of habits are growing that we have to kind of undermine? Where are forms of leverage that kind of curtail with opportunities? Where is the organising already taking place? And where can we kind of put some energy, some real energy into workplace opportunities for multiracial solidarity, basically. I think it's really important that you said the stuff that, you know, the stuff you learn in school in your geography lesson is kind of push and pull factors, right? Which is to say that, like, we do also have to talk about the push factors, right? Which is like the uneven global political economy, imperialism, legacies of war mean that, like, it's not just good enough to say that it's great for migrants to come here to fill in all of these jobs, right? The jobs that we won't do. We also have to talk about why migrants come here in the first place, which is their life conditions elsewhere are devastated, right? Whether that's the EU impoverishing Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, whether that's wars, whatever it is, right? It's really clear that we talk about that. And it's worth saying as well that immigration is the kind of context in which these battles have taken place within the form of the nation state, but it doesn't start necessarily with immigration, right? Because there's kind of popular reconstructions of consent for empire in the past. There's that kind of staging moment between the transition from kind of empire to nation state in this country. There's the kind of Enoch Powell and the way in which the energy of Powellism converted through the NF, the National Front, but then the energy went with Thatcher. You know, it was Powell that originally started talking about the numbers, how many people were coming into this country, and how much of a defining feature of our political lives has that been, the numbers, right? It's been huge. And then, of course, there's kind of Farage's, or Farage, let's call him Farage's adaptation of that language in a kind of period of zero-sum declinism. And I think it's important. It's really important for me. I'm a part of a reading group in Stoke at the minute with some comrades and friends. The book we're reading at the minute is Paul Gilroy's classic, Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. Really recommend everyone read that. It's a seminal book. And, you know, he's really brilliant at talking about how the management of the nation state has to also be the policing of borders, right? So this is intrinsically a question of the nation too, so that you might have nice forms of the regime, but they are dependent on one another, right? And the left has to think about that question in its quest to kind of, in some instances, to kind of take over the nation state. He has this line, which I just think is really pithy. It is as if the only problem with nationalism is that the Tories have secured a near exclusive monopoly of it. And when you think about the Blue Labours, the Andy Burnhams, but also attempts to kind of triangulate further to the left during Corbynism and elsewhere, plenty of examples across Europe, it's just like we can do better than this, really. One thing I said, and I think I have said this on a previous episode, like I guess I'm a bit more cagey about the open borders, because I think, not because I don't want open borders, I do, right? Like for human beings, I just think that in terms of framing, open borders can often lend itself to a kind of more liberal Europeanist framing that sounds like you're the European Union. It's like, well, there are some people we don't want open borders for, and you know, it's not migrants, it's not refugees, it's capitalists 100%. And their money, right? and there's one big border for them, but open border for everybody else. That's kind of my opinion.
Just to say, that's the point I was making. I wasn't making an argument for or against open borders, and actually I don't think open borders is the language that we should use. I don't. But the point I wanted to make was that the status quo allows open borders for some people, and we're too scared to actually make the case for humans, but we allow it for capital.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, taking the nation state without nationalism, that is the kind of core project of an eco-socialist or socialist party that is internationalist in its politics, but also contesting power at the national level. And yeah, we talked a lot about how you can construct an open and generous and multiracial and inclusive identity at the level of a city, as Zoran has done, as Sadiq has done to a certain extent in London, as Burnham has done to a certain extent in Manchester. I think the municipality lends itself to that.
Yeah.
Doing that at the national level, I think, is far harder because you just are in charge of borders.
Yeah.
You run borders, so it's like,
That's
what are you going to do about them?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
100%.
And you exist in relation to other nation states. That's the other unit that you are dealing with if you're running your nation state. And I do often think that, I'm not going to put this as your view because I'm not quite sure it is, but it came through in some of the stuff that you said, where it's like, you're completely right. The living standards that we have in the global north are completely dependent on extraction and exploitation of the global south. That's just undeniable. It's completely undeniable. I think a wrinkle in it is that I think it's called an imperial dividend in some of the literature. That imperial dividend obviously ends up concentrated in some places and not others. There's parts of Britain where they see very little of that compared to the city of London. Obviously, there's distinctions there. But fundamentally, the question is: do we think we can build a global socialist movement that unites the working class in different countries here and in the global south? And if we kind of don't, because we think that the living conditions in the global north are just too good now, to a certain extent, or people are too comfortable, they have too much to revolt in a serious way, which I think is a completely reasonable position to take. I don't think it's where I end up, but I think it's completely reasonable. Then I think you do end up in just a kind of a third worldist politics where you're not engaging in party projects that are trying to contest the state, but you're probably raising money for struggles in the global south in various places. And I think that is, for everyone who's on the political journey, it's an important conclusion to come to. Because I think if you think there is hope in the working class of the global north, you end up contesting parties in some way. If you don't, then you end up in a very different politics.
Yeah, just to come back on that, and I think there was a missing point and part of my argument, which you just highlighted, which is that the argument doesn't stop there. It would be kind of like really unhelpful liberal identity politics to be like, well, actually, the West extracts from the global south, and therefore the West just need to shut up about their living standards. That's not helpful. The point more...
It might be true, though.
I don't think it is true. I don't think it is true.
It might be true.
Because actually, I don't think we should tolerate the kind of living standards that we have in this country anyway. Even though they are better than many people around the world, I actually think the argument shouldn't stop there. The argument is like, look, your class is exploiting them, and their class is exploiting them, and they're now coming here. And actually, we're all fucking being exploited by these fucking capitalist assholes. Yeah. So instead of, for me, the argument should go, you're turning around to a migrant who is being fucked over by your ruling class and fucked over by their ruling class, and you're pointing at them as if they're the problem. Whereas actually we're all being fucked up by the global ruling class. So what we doing, mate? That, for me, is the conclusion.
Yeah.
What we doing, mate? Get it on a T-shirt.
Underneath, I'm a principles girl.
And I suppose that's where the unions come back in, right? Because, you two, you've talked really well about this enforced competition in the labour market between migrants and, like British-born and native-born workers, often done through the visa regimes, just like really punitive visa regimes where, migrant workers they have to work in certain jobs based on these visas. They lose their visas if they don't work in those jobs. They are often essentially imprisoned in workplaces, and these people just can't be organised, and they're always going to undercut British-born labour. And really, the unions, instead of taking a regressive position and saying we don't want any migrants, need to be saying we need closed shop unions, we need to end these visa regimes, 100%. And there needs to be fair the ability for people to work and also struggle together. If only we had union leadership that did more of that. If only. If only. Just to wind it back a bit, though, to them, I very much agree that a lot of anti-migrant sentiment can't just be reduced to economism. I really agree with that, and I think it is important to divide up people who, support reform in a way where they are just vehemently anti-migrant and or racist, and they've always been that hardcore kind of like far-right contingent in the country, and other people that might vaguely want change, or they see them as an option for change, or they're dissatisfied with their economic conditions or their material conditions or whatever. We should also separate economic and material as well, because they're not quite the same thing. Yeah. I think maybe where I disagree is, or not disagree, but where I'd become more of a...
It's all right to disagree.
Nah, but I don't quite disagree though. But it's like where I become more focused on the economic stuff is when we move from our analysis of kind of what's going on in the world and why people have racist or anti-migrant feelings towards our strategy for beating that coalition.
Yeah.
And when it comes to our strategy for beating that coalition, I do just think economic populism is still the biggest and strongest lever we have to pull. There's some, I'd say, quite speculative research that came out from Persuasion UK this week. I mean, it's kind of propaganda aimed at Burnham, and I'm fine with it. But Steve Akers in it basically makes the argument that, Labour would trash reform if it went on an economic populist program where they, put the buses down to bus cap at like £1 per journey, like all of this kind of stuff, and they tested loads of different policies. And that if you're looking at it in terms of this left bloc and right bloc politics, where you have a left bloc that is united on the economic but divided on the social, and you have a right bloc that is divided on the economic but united on the social, makes complete sense. Mm-hmm. I basically think the political battle in this country between the parties comes down to, can you make everyone pay attention and care about the issues that unite your people and divide their people? Can you do that? And for us, that's talking about economic populism and not talking about cultural issues, social issues, and migration, So I think that's just where I'd emphasize that. I think when you get to the strategic, the economic becomes very important. But you're right, that just bleeds into our analysis. And that's really bad, because you can't come up with a good and strong, robust strategy that can change if you don't have an analysis that's honest. You know what I mean? And accurate and actually reckons with what's actually going on.
This might come out all higgledy-piggledy, gobbledy-goopy.
I bet it won't. I bet it won't, though, mate.
Rarely happens.
Yeah. Come on.
But I'm just putting the thoughts together because, I think it's hard to figure out exactly which points are more salient at which times and not. But if you look back to the historic rise of fascism, they always happened in a time of economic decline and crisis, more or less, almost exclusively. Not always, but almost. The big 20th century moments in Europe, there were decades of economic decline and stagnation and resentment that grows out of that. So, of course, the economic situation is important. It's utterly relevant. But then what the far right do is they write onto that cultural symbols of strength, of prosperity, of unity, of togetherness. And they write that onto a context where people are feeling precarious and hard done by and unable to kind of build the kind of life that they want. So for me, these things are always connected, right? The cultural and the political and the symbols are not separate to the economy. They're the way in which people understand their role in the economy and in the world. And I'm not sure that we can just do economic populism. And I don't even think that's the lesson of Mamdani, without also doing the cultural and without also speaking to the symbols. Because what he did so well was Mamdani, not Mussolini or Hitler, just to clarify. What he did so well was he used cultural signifiers to make an economic populist argument, and he didn't ignore the cultural side. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the opposite. Yeah. It was, it was core of how he communicated his economic populism. And that's what the right does. They exude strength and power and growth through culture. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly the conclusion. I'm not saying the right, we need to emulate the right or we need to emulate Mamdani. But I think more what I'm saying is I think the separation between these spheres is false because people... We know that most people don't primarily see themselves as economic agents first. They see themselves as belonging to a place or belonging to a people or belonging to a community. And that's how they understand and frame their political and economic reality.
And let's be real, the only reason Andy Burnham's even getting a hearing is because he is able to do all of that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's of Manchester. He's of the North. He has a certain charisma. He taps into a certain sense of what it means to be British, which is not rooted in London, it's rooted somewhere else like that. That is why he's getting a hearing. If it was somebody else that was elected Labour leader that had none of that, and they were like, "Yeah, I'm going to do an economically interventionist, economically populist program," it wouldn't work. Yeah, it wouldn't work.
Can I go on a bit of a rant?
Go for it.
Yeah, because
no, mate.
As long as it's rich and supple, then yeah, go.
Yeah, come on, give us your rich and supple rant.
Never going to live that one down, am I?
No, that will persist.
Because I think you're totally right, Shanice, to raise this point that we shouldn't be anchoring our kind of proactive arguments for anti-racist solidarity, proactive arguments for reducing immigration controls or getting rid, and our proactive arguments for internationalist solidarity upon whether or not migrants are good for the economy. I think that's totally right. In no small part, and I think you see the realities of this today in the discourse, because if levels of migration are declining, which they have been for about a year or so now, and the economy sucks, that argument still so often works against the left, right? So I think there's a deeper point here, basically, that I think we need to get to the bottom of, that kind of also addresses the stuff about economic populism and its relationship to the cultural question. I've been flicking through recently what I think is one of the best books any leftist has ever written, which is Raymond Williams' The Long Revolution. And in that, he identifies 3 strands which kind of shape this long societal revolution that he identifies being unleashed across the course of the 20th century. So he talks about democratization, industrialization, and the massification of culture, right? As these kind of 3 big thematic pins of the long revolution in the 20th century. What are our equivalent strands today? And I'm going to have a pop at this, right?
Here we go. The burning of the planet and runaway climate change, obviously. The kind of productive exhaustion of capitalism in large parts of the world. Obviously, there are exceptions. China is one of them. And how that's typified in speculative bubbles, slum populations in the global south, relative surplus populations in the global north, and demographic aging across the world. The demise of US hegemony, kind of violent imperial consequences of this process in wars and genocides. And of course, the smartphones and the online platforms through which we watch all of this shit happen. And the difficulty for the left is that migration runs through all of these questions. It is central to all of these questions when you think about it. And it's unavoidable. And I think the left has to take this seriously because the right have answers to this stuff. They're not very nice. And right now, the centre is acting upon it for them. Yeah, exactly.
And the pressure for the left, just as you say, particularly in a moment of demographic aging, of increasing poor health and sickness across the population, particularly its working class parts, the temptation is to simply say, we need migrants here to service shit for us and look after us.
Yep.
And that pressure is going to be big in that kind of context. But it's never going to be enough on its own to counter the right story, because the right story is a civilizational story. It's not simply a cultural story or an economic story. It's at a kind of bigger meta level, right? And that's why I think there are kind of 2 strands of thinking here that we should lean on when we kind of renew our languages for the kind of epoch that we seem to be walking into. Firstly, the word interdependency for me is really important. You know, Joe's a comms guy here. I don't know how we make this purchasable, but that like, the basic argument that we do not get anywhere in life without each other. We're humans. We need each other. We want to fight for a world where that need for each other is generative and generous, but not zero-sum, not competitive, not exploitative. And secondly, and I take this from Sivamohan Valuvan, whose book, The Clamours of Nationalism, everyone should read, and who's got a book that I'm really excited for about pubs, actually. He talks about there being an everyday multicultural that already exists, right? An everyday multicultural that is distinct from state multiculturalism, the kind of political managers and corporations. You know, white kids like me growing up speaking broken patois, Nigerian kids moving to London wearing Arsenal shirts and going to a parade and having a good day. Not Tottenham fans, obviously. You know, I've been watching most of the World Cup at a Ghanaian bar that doubles up as a club at night. You've got ginger kids becoming reverts. You've got Muslim kids going...
Why is it always the ginger kids,
Why is it always the gingers?
Yeah,
it's crazy.
It's
crazy.
so true.
It's always
so
the
true.
gingers.
So true.
I was close. But you've got ginger kids becoming reverts. You've got Muslim kids going to freshers, drinking mocktails with their mates at the bar. And you've got young Republicans in the north of Ireland putting leaflets through the letterboxes of migrant houses saying, we're here for you if you need anything. We will defend you. You have a right to live where we live too. And that's the positive fucking vision of what life in this country could be. And we need to start putting that front and center, wedding it to a vision of not being priced out, of having access to public space and having a much more refined sense of having much more control over our time, right? I think there's a particular word here, control, that we have to try and reappropriate in some way, actually. I think that's the kind of missing bit here. And all of this requires a redefinition of what the good life is. Because I think you raise a good point, right? Which is that, like, there is this massive unevenness in the world, right, in terms of resources and power. And I think part of reimagining what the good life is, having a conversation that interrogates that and says there's a different way of living your life here in Britain that doesn't have to come at the expense of people in the global south. Yeah. And so of course, all of this for me is a matter of principle, but like also I think there's a kind of, there's something about the moment we're living through here where migration cuts through everything. It's unavoidable, and it just isn't good enough to have the kind of the liberal economism effectively and the kind of stuff we get from more rightwards parts of the labour movement. 2
points. Yes, completely agree. But I think there's an added bit to it, or there's an added plank to that strategy, which is that we need to not only criticise the position of the right and not only distinguish ourselves from liberals with regards to geopolitics and how we talk about, the nation and migration on a global stage, but also domestically, and just be really critical of like the Blairite multicultural agenda where, the 1999 Dispersal Act, where they basically said, okay, we're going to send asylum seekers to the poorest parts of the country because that's where it's cheapest to house them. So that's what we're going to do. And you send them to communities who, in your words, have had so little control over their lives for so long and have had so many things imposed on them from the outside, whether it's, shutting down of mines and factories and steelworks and neoliberalism in different forms, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that was just a complete disaster. Like a complete disaster. It doesn't work for people coming here because obviously you want to go somewhere where you're going to feel safe, where you're going to feel accepted, where you can exercise agency, ideally where you're around people who speak your language and understand your culture, at least somewhat, i.e. you probably want to be in towns and cities, And it was just a terrible policy that was set up to ensure the rise of anti-migrant sentiment, the rise of the right, and essentially undercut Labour's base in these northern, small-town, rural areas. And it was just fucking stupid and terrible. I think the second thing that I'd say is that I thought your summary of, the broader meta factors were really good, but I think there's a fifth, which speaks to a big difficulty for the right with regards to migration, which is aging global north societies.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And this is the thing is
and
that...
birth rate.
And birth rates. And birth rates along with those. And this is the thing for the right, is that the right are completely contradictory with regards to migration, actually completely contradictory, because you have the ideological, maybe white nationalist, anti-migrant sections of it that are like, no, we don't want any migrants, we don't want any black and brown people coming into the country. And then you have the wealthy capitalist elite sections, i.e. Elon Musk in the US, who say, but who am I going to get to work for me really cheaply? Where's all the cheap labour going to come from? No one's having kids anymore. Like, what are we going to do? And there's, a massive bust up between Elon Musk and different parts of the MAGA movement a year or two ago over H-1B visas, which were specifically a visa that, benefited billionaires that are employing cheap labour through migration. And this is just a massive problem for the right, which is why they focus hugely on trying to increase birth rates. But how are you gonna make people want to have kids when it's just so materially hard to have kids now?
It's also just not all about economics, right?
It's not all about economics, but it's like as a baseline, as like a fundamental baseline. It's just like materially really hard, and not just because you don't have money, but you also don't have family near, because we've all been encouraged to do very small migrations ourselves from the places that we grew up through university to then cities.
Schools closing in London because people aren't having
them. Yeah. You know what I mean? There's schools in Hackney. Primary schools just shutting down.
So this is the thing. I completely agree that the left is in a difficult position with regards to migration, especially understanding that migration politics just is politics now in a large sense, especially because of Burning Planet and all the climate migrants that we're going to get. Like that, it just is politics now. But the right is also contradicting that too.
Just one thing to that, right? Because, what the right does then in this moment of demographic age, and that's a kind of problem for them, right? It sets a trap for the left as well, right? Which is that, do you just fall in line and you say, we just need these migrants basically to service people as they get older and sicker, right? We've talked about that on the one hand. That's a trap for the left, I think.
And it's a trap that Zach fell into on Question Time and was criticised for it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
He said, who else are going to wipe the bums of old people?
Yeah, dreadful.
And he was correctly criticised. It's kind of like he was correctly criticised for it. It was also kind of like a real statement at the same time, but he was correctly criticised from a political perspective, I think.
Which kind of comes to my point about how do you redefine interdependency here, right?
Yeah.
But I also think like there is a compromise for the right here, which it is a real problem for them. But like the problem is the increasing ascendancy of the right means that on the one hand, they want less and less migrants in the country, right? Less and less refugees in the country, right? And all of their politics orientates around that kind of single politic, that kind of single demand. But there is also a positive to that for them, which is because we also have to remember that large parts of the right have a relationship to parts of capital who have an interest in low, cheap, poor citizenship rights for migrants, right? And so that dynamic creates those circumstances. Right? It creates circumstances where, you get less migrants, but you get migrants who come over to the country with even worse life conditions.
Yes,
and that is advantageous to the kinds of people who support Kemi Badenoch's party, then that support Nigel Farage's party. So I do think that is a big tension for the right. I don't want to underwrite that, but it also comes as a kind of problem for us, which is the increasing radicalization and ascendancy of the right means that it's not just a problem for them. It also means that the people whose kind of interests they serve benefit pretty neatly from it because they benefit from the polarization of migrant lives.
Just to come back to something that you said, Joe, about the Asian population and the collapsing birth rates actually in the West. And this is why.
And in parts of East Asia. And
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Japan's a big one.
Japan's a massive one, yeah. But this is why, and again, this comes back to the left's shit analysis on immigration. This is why we're also seeing a rise in anti-trans and anti-women sentiment, right? And this, the rise in the manosphere and this idea of return to natural womanhood and natural masculinity, because it goes hand in hand. There are some on the right who are really attuned to the fact that if you can't have migrants, then you have to have women in the home making babies. And you can't have women in the home making babies if men are transitioning to be women and if women are going out and doing jobs and getting educated. And there are some on the right who are really attuned to this and who recognise, and, I've always asked this question, why in like the early 2000s was Nadia on Big Brother, who was trans, just like bare chill?
Yeah, me too.
No one said nothing.
Never even thought about that.
Everyone loved her.
Yeah.
She won, didn't she?
She won, yeah.
She won, no problem. Trans woman, win Big Brother, wicked. She was a cultural icon. How can we go for... She was wicked. And she was a migrant, wasn't she? From a migrant background.
I can't remember where, but you're right.
I think it's like Greece, maybe? Something like that.
Yeah.
How can we go from that to where we are today, where trans people are being booted out of toilets? And actually, there are some on the right who have done it deliberately, who are really attuned to the fact that actually in order to achieve this immigrant-free society that they want, you're going to have to put women back in the home. And therefore, you're going to have very stringent gender norms where you are not allowed to transition, where gender can't be fluid and flexible, where we go back to biological essentialism, which has no reality to actual nature. And it's a complete political construct. And just on your point, Jonas, on redefining interdependence, maybe we can go back to Sivanandan. Who's ever said that before? Let's go back. Let's go back to Sivanandan. And sometimes I think it's Sivanandan, is it John LaRose? But it's we are here because you were there. Remember that? Yeah. But it's often positioned as being antagonist. You're against me, but I'm only here because you were over there. But actually, I'm here because you were there. I'm here because you're here.
Yeah.
There is a potent like kind of humanity to that, right? Like that actually we are all everywhere, and that is an essential part of what it means to be human.
Just to clarify, Nadia Almada was Portuguese born.
Portuguese.
And won.
Cut that.
No.
That is staying in, Bridget. It's fully staying in. And she captured 74% of the public vote. Your favourite transphobe could never. Literally, it's crazy how it's just completely shifted. We have this idea of progress, that society progresses. But this is a case where, no, we've massively regressed. Massively, to the point where, to go back to that book that I mentioned last week, the actual reality of not gender, not the social construct of gender, of sex in nature is so complex and so diverse. It's amazing how many different ways there are to do male and female in the actual real animal kingdom. And then politically, how we restrict the category so much
and how we put humans into these horrifically narrow and limited boxes because of our political inclinations to categorize and box and get people to be socially productive or reproductive in certain ways. It's just so boring.
Yeah,
it's just so boring, man. And like, that's just the part of it that just makes me so sad. Like, transphobia is shit in and of itself, but also the kind of world that the right want to build is just dry.
Well, I feel like for me that's one of the fundamental divisions, although it never gets portrayed as such. Where the right is fundamentally a constrictive and restrictive politics and view of humanity. They want people to be deathly similar and automatons and repressed in all these different ways. And it's why we always talk about, or people always talk about, the left being on the side of freedom and expression and autonomy, almost self-actualization. You know what I mean? Like, how can you have
actual sovereignty?
Yeah, like,
but we have lost that.
Yeah, we have. We've lost the whole language.
For sure.
I mean, this is the last thing I'll say on this, but like, it's just to that kind of dryness and to what you were saying about freedom. Like when I go on my estate, I love my estate because like when the weather's good, like you just have kids from all over the world just chilling, like in the park from everywhere. They're from everywhere, and they're not stuck at home on their phones getting miserable. Like, do you know what I mean? They're having a good time with their mates, and they might have all sorts of stuff going on in their lives and their parents' lives, but when they're in that park next to my house, they're having the best time with their brethren. And like, that's a vision for the future that the right just can't tap into.
Yeah.
Maybe one bit of this will be the last thing I say, but I think one bit of liberal immigration policy that I actually think a socialist government could extend in various ways, and that I think is actually really interesting, obviously limited by the fact that this was only in response to a specific war, was the Homes for Ukraine program, where 100,000 people volunteered rooms in their houses for Ukrainian refugees. Like 100,000 people. Like what? Like, if we got in, you could have a national mobilization in the same way, but not tied to a war, not tied to a specific people from a country, but it's just like, people coming from anywhere who want to settle in this country. And it'd kind of be great in the sense that the right are always saying, well, all of you like lefty progressives, you should then take all these people. But I would be like, we will. Yeah, we will actually. Yeah. And I think loads of people would sign up. I actually think loads of people would sign up. I'm sure it wouldn't be without difficulty. I'm sure lots of people would have like needs that need to be met, whatever. But just as a way of doing like government migration policy as a popular welcoming mobilization. I just kind of like love that concept, and it's already been done.
Sorry, I know that was the last thing I said. I said before.
I didn't believe it, mate. Don't worry.
And then this is tied to a kind of, political emergency, obviously. But like the amount of people I've met on the left, older people 10, 20, 30, older than that, like people a lot older than us, right, who accepted a Chilean into their house in the 70s, finished it, and made friends for fucking life. Imagine if that wasn't tied to the emergence of a fascist dictatorship in Latin America.
It's just a thing people did.
Yeah, it's just a thing that people did.
And it's a thing people did out of solidarity with working class people from different parts of the world, but also on the understanding that it's going to enrich your life.
Exactly.
And make it better.
There is an elephant in the room, which is with Ukraine. The reason why that happened was because of Ukrainians' proximity to Britishness and whiteness, and that we can't deny.
And they've already changed the refugee status of Palestinians now because the genocide is apparently over.
Yeah,
but we could change that if we like.
For sure. Thanks for that chat. And finally, to round out and say goodbye, what should everybody else be reading or listening to this week? Shanice.
So I'm going to give a shout out. So we're actually recording this episode on the day we're doing our live event, our first live event. And by the time you hear this, the live event will be over. So you can buy tickets if you want, but there will be no live event for you to go to.
I'll buy them anyway. But
I want to give a shout out to our brethren Joshua Virasamy in the context of this conversation. He edited a book called A World Without Racism, Building Anti-Racist Futures. And that is a book that is a collection of different essays from people across the movement on questions of migration, anti-racism, and actually how we do some of that organising work of, ushering in that new world, a vision for an Anti-Racist Future. So definitely check that one out by Pluto Press. I was involved in writing the chapter that Sisters Uncut put together. So it was multiple people from Sisters Uncut who came together to write that chapter. So yeah, check it out.
Yeah, and I've read his introduction to it as well, and it's really brilliant.
It's a good book. Yeah.
Joe,
I'll do 2 to show off. Why not?
forget about it.
I have read the entire Productive State report that Commonwealth wrote for mainstream. I've actually read it. It's really good. I think it's a really good articulation of the most radical Burnham could get. It is, I mean, for those that don't know, Commonwealth and Matt worked a lot on the McDonnell agenda under Corbyn, and their whole thing is about ownership of, the essentials of the economy, and also under McDonnell, it was about the democratization of the economy too. Obviously, a lot of that is gone, but the ownership stuff remains, and it's just like a really good intervention in the moment. I think it wasn't unlike the Barry Gardiner piece that came out for mainstream a couple of weeks later, written by ChatGPT. so that's good. That's a good start. Not written by ChatGPT. But anyway, that's my political one. My non-political one, I'm continuing my theme of just picking random books from charity shops and our parents' shelves. This time it's The Feast by Margaret Kennedy. Don't know if you've ever read it. Okay. It is about a hotel on the Cornish coast called the Penderzac Manor Hotel, which is under a cliff that's about to collapse onto it and kill everyone in it. And you know this is going to happen from the start of the novel, but then you're introduced to all of these kind of like mad interwar. I think it's like it's just after the Second World War, and it's like all of these like mad kind of like middle class to bourgeois characters all interacting in these crazy ways, and you fall in love with one of them, and then you start to hate another one of them, and it's this weird intellectual, but you know they're all going to die. You know they're all going to die. So the cliff,
they don't know.
They don't know, but because it goes, so the cliff literally hangs over the novel for you as the reader.
Wow, that's remarkable.
Yeah, it's cool, right? Yeah. And I was reading it, and I was like, if I ever write a novel, I want to write a novel like this, where like you kind of know the ending from the start, but in a way where it hangs over. And, yeah, it's just really good.
I love that. Really in English lit, where you're taught all of these different like literary techniques you can use, and that one just feels
it's really
so
good.
satisfying.
And it's so satisfying because it's a cliff. You know what I mean? Because it's a cliff. But yeah,
does the book end on a cliffhanger? Because that would just be taking a piss at that point.
I haven't finished it.
Okay,
I haven't. I don't think it will. I'm like 20 pages. I don't think it will. But yeah, I'm loving it.
You never know.
What you got, Jonas? What you got?
Mine's not a book this week. I've been listening to Resonance FM, who have hosted an amazing series, a 10-episode series hosted by Kay Biswas, and it's a series orientated around recently released Stuart Hall lectures.
Yeah, I really want to listen to this. When you sent it me, it looked great.
in from Naples, and it's kind of
they were in Naples as well.
They took place in Naples.
Stuart Hall in Naples.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's called
Living in the Wrong Time. Living in the Wrong Time.
It's called English Stitch. It's it's amazing. Like there's some stuff about like pubs and morality and class formation and kind of the development of capitalism in this country. There's this the final episode is just brilliant because it has like it's like him walking out of his house, and it's like he's doing an ethnography of Kilburn High Road, which is just brilliant. And there's all sorts of stuff for everybody in there. It's got all sorts of guests like Verhoeven, who I spoke about here, and people like Jeremy Gilbert and
amazing
Catherine Hall, Stuart Hall's partner, and his daughter Becky Hall, who gave a really moving interview. Really recommend people go and listen to that.
Nice.
Banging.
All right. We love your feedback, so please give us a comment on Spotify, Apple, podlifeattheparty@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Shanice. Thanks to Joe. Thanks to Marcus, the producer.
Woo!
And we will see you later, guys.
Also, have we told everyone we've got 2,000 followers on Spotify now? Did
no.
we say that?
What?
We have more than 2,000 followers on Spotify.
Wow.
Big up. Thank you, everyone.
So when you listen to the pod and you know you're not a follower, go click that follower button.
Be a follower.
Laters, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
This is an Ampersounds production.